So this is the last section of basic chemistry that we're going to be discussing, and today in this part we're going to be looking at organic molecules as opposed to inorganic molecules. So let's review just briefly the difference between organic and inorganic molecules. So remember, organic molecules contain carbon, and that carbon is bound to at least one hydrogen, covalently bonded molecules. Inorganic compounds are things that don't have carbon, such as water, salts, acids and bases, and things like that. Today we're going to focus on organic compounds and what they are and what they do. So within organic compounds, or within organic molecules, we can split all the types of organic molecules into four larger categories. And this is true of us as well. So we're made of organic molecules. You could take your body and break it down into all the organic molecules, and all the parts of your body would fit into one of these four categories. Some of these you've probably heard about. Well, hopefully all of these you've heard about. They may just have a little bit different name than what you're used to. First one is carbohydrates, meaning sugars basically. Next is lipids, which is another word for fats in general. And then there's also proteins, which I'm sure you've heard about. And then nucleic acids, which you may or may not have heard about. We'll talk about each of these today. So first of all, carbohydrates. So what is a carbohydrate? A carbohydrate contains carbon, so it's an organic molecule. It also contains hydrogen and an oxygen in a certain ratio. The ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen is always the same in carbohydrates. And this ratio is going to be CH2O. So if you take any form, any combination of one carbon, two hydrogens, and oxygen, you're going to end up with a carbohydrate. One good example we already talked about is glucose. If you look at glucose, C6H12O6, it fits this combination. So take the carbon times 6, the hydrogen 2 times 6, you get 12. Anyway, so glucose is a carbohydrate. Sugars fit in this, starches, also mentioned glycogen, things like that. Carbohydrates are classified according to their size, and if you look at the words here, you'll understand what they mean. So we have what are called monosaccharides. Mono means one. So these are our simple sugars. Glucose is a monosaccharide. There's just a few examples of monosaccharides. Glucose, fructose, if you've heard of that, galactose. And there's also ribose and deoxyribose, which may or may not be familiar. Those are examples of simple sugars. If you take a carbohydrate, break it down into its simplest form, those are going to be the monosaccharides. Then we have what are called disaccharides. Di meaning two, saccharide meaning sugars. So in disaccharides, we take two simple sugars, hook them together, now we have a disaccharide. Polysaccharides are the third type. Poly meaning many sugars. So if we take many simple sugars and hook them all together in long chains, now we have polysaccharides. All of our carbohydrates are going to fit into one of these categories here. The way that our body, or the way that organisms take these different classifications, add them together, is shown here in this picture. So here's a monosaccharide. This is a diagram showing a monosaccharide. If we look at this here, what this is representing, so you see this hexagon-shaped molecule here, that is a carbon ring. So this O represents oxygen. What isn't just picture are the carbons. So each of these corners of this hexagon is actually a carbon molecule. So if we were to draw all the carbons in, this molecule would actually look something like this. And there's our oxygen. And then we have these lines coming off. Those lines represent where the hydrogens are bonded to the carbons. So the thing about carbon is that it always has 4 bonds. If we were to draw out carbon, carbon has the atomic number of 6, which means that it has 6 protons, and then the electrons are situated, 2 in the inside shell, and then we have 4 left to occupy the next shell. This means that in order for the carbon atom to be stable or to be happy, it needs 4 more electrons, and it does that by forming covalent bonds with a number of things. This carbon atom here is what makes organic molecules so versatile. It's because it's able to bond with so many different things. So every carbon here is going to bond with 4 other things. I'm not going to draw in the rest of the hydrogens, but each of these carbons here is going to have 2 hydrogens attached to it. So this is what glucose actually looks like, all the carbons and hydrogens written in, except I didn't finish all the hydrogens. But because it is an organic molecule, the carbons can be taken out of the molecule, not taken out, but when you draw the molecule as they did in this little diagram, they just didn't show you where the carbons and hydrogens are, and you're supposed to know, since it is an organic molecule, that everywhere you have a little junction here, that's where the carbons are, and these are where the hydrogens are. So this is a monosaccharide, this is glucose. If we count up the carbons, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we actually have 1 more carbon coming off here to form 6, and that's going to be our glucose. And then if we count up all the hydrogens off of that, this carbon would have 3 hydrogens because it needs 3 more bonds. This guy's just going to have 1. If you counted up all those hydrogens, you'd find 12. And then you're going to have oxygens coming off here as well that I also didn't draw in. But each of these bonds here, so this has a hydrogen, we're also going to have an oxygen here. So each of these carbons is bonded to an oxygen and a hydrogen. And here's going to be an oxygen and a hydrogen. We're going to have an oxygen and a hydrogen and a hydrogen, etc. So we're going to end up with 6 oxygen molecules. And then our carbons and our hydrogens. So when you draw that whole thing out, you'll have C6H12O6. We can take these simple sugars here and connect them together to form a disaccharide. So we can take these 2 glucose molecules, hook them together, and form a disaccharide. We can then take groups of these and hook them together to form a polysaccharide. This is starch. All of these little green hexagons, each of those represent a glucose molecule. So we see these long chains of glucose molecules. This is what starch is. Glycogen, which I mentioned before, is a similar type of molecule. Starch is how plants store glucose. Glycogen is how animals store glucose. Looks very similar to starch, except it's going to have some more branches. Those are the types of carbohydrates. The way that you take simple sugars and build them into more complex sugars, disaccharides and polysaccharides, is something called a dehydration or hydrolysis reaction, which are types of synthesis and decomposition reactions. So notice here we have 2 glucose molecules. These glucose molecules, well, we have a glucose and a fructose molecule, sorry. This glucose molecule has an OH, the fructose has an OH, and so what we can do is we can remove water, H2O, from these molecules here, and by doing that we're able to bond them together. So this is called a dehydration. We're removing, or we're dehydrating the molecules to form a larger molecule. Hydrolysis, we're hydrating, so this reaction can also go the other way. If we were to add water back into this bond, it's going to break the glucose and fructose apart, and we call this a hydrolysis reaction. This is true for carbohydrates, this is true for lipids, proteins, or nucleic acids. The way that we take smaller organic molecules and build larger organic molecules is always with a dehydration reaction. Whenever we take larger organic molecules and break them into smaller organic molecules, we are doing hydrolysis reactions. Lipids. Lipids are the second type of organic compound. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen just like carbohydrates, but they're in a different ratio than the carbohydrates are. And something special about lipids is that they're always insoluble in water. So lipids that we have in the body, we have fats. These are called the triglycerides. and we'll look at why they're called triglycerides in just a second here. This is what the fat, when you think of fat, this is what it is. It's a triglyceride. One of the functions is it's where we store energy. So glucose is what we use to burn in our body to form energy. If we have too much glucose floating around, our body can put it into glycogen and store it, but that's a short-term energy storage. If we still have extra glucose, our body's going to start producing triglycerides, which are a long-term energy storage. We also use it for insulation, for cushioning of organs and things like that. So lipids have a lot of functions in our body. The reason it's called a triglyceride is because it's made of a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acid chains. So the tri, meaning 3, triglyceride, glycerol. So tri meaning the 3 fatty acids. Sorry, let me start that. Can I start that again? Tri meaning the 3 fatty acids, and the glyceride meaning the glycerol. So you take 3 fatty acid chains, hook them to a glycerol molecule. We now have a triglyceride. The way you do this, dehydration reaction. Notice here we're taking out water. So if we have a glycerol molecule, 3 fatty acid chains, by removing water in a dehydration reaction, we form a triglyceride. If we wanted to go the other way and break down the fat, we'd use a hydrolysis reaction, putting in water. Lipids are insoluble in water because of these fatty acid chains. What a fatty acid chain is it's just a long chain of carbons and hydrogens all hooked together. Carbon and hydrogen hooked together is a non-polar molecule. It's covalently bonded together, but there's no polarity there, not like water, where you have a positive and negative side caused by the polarity of the molecule. Because of that, if you were to put a water molecule next to a fat molecule, the water molecule is not attracted to the fat molecule at all because there's no polarity. And so these are insoluble in water. Water cannot dissolve a fat. Other types of lipids in our body, very important, phospholipids. In the next section, or the next lecture, we're going to talk about cells. And every cell in our body has a phospholipid membrane around it. This phospholipid membrane is a lipid. The reason it's called a phospholipid is because it has a phosphate group as well as the fatty acid chains. Here's a phospholipid. Notice here we have a phosphorus group here. We have our glycerol molecule, but then we only have 2 fatty acid chains, and one of the fatty acid chains has a little kink in it. So it looks like a couple of legs. It's often drawn like this over here. You have your phosphate group represented by the head of the molecule, and then the 2 fatty acid chains make the tail, or what look like legs. The thing that is significant about a phospholipid is that it has a polar head. So this phosphate group here is attracted to water. It's hydrophilic. The fatty acid chains are still insoluble in water. They're what we call hydrophobic, or scared of water. And so this molecule, different than a triglyceride, which is all insoluble, all hydrophobic, a phospholipid has a hydrophilic side and a hydrophobic side. This becomes important in cell membranes. We'll look at that again, as I mentioned in the next chapter. Okay, we also have steroids. Steroids are also lipids. Steroids, you're familiar probably with steroid hormones. Those are steroids. Cholesterol is also a steroid, as well as bile salts, vitamin D. And so steroids are very important. Here's an example of a steroid. This is cholesterol. When we think about cholesterol, we usually associate that today with good and bad cholesterol and having too much cholesterol and things like that. That is true. There is a such thing as what's called HDL and LDL, which is good and bad cholesterol. But cholesterol is essential in our body. If we didn't have any cholesterol, we wouldn't be able to survive. This is how we make hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and this is also used in the membranes of our cells. We have to have cholesterol. So cholesterol is important, but our body can make all the cholesterol that we need, so we don't necessarily have to get cholesterol in our diet. So those are some examples of lipids. We have triglycerides, we have steroids, and then we also have phospholipids.